September 2008. The most famous photograph of a generation. Men and women in good suits, walking out of a glass tower, carrying their entire careers in cardboard boxes. The world looked at that picture and filed it under one heading, casualty of the financial crisis. Another company swept away by the storm. But here's what the caption missed. This patient was not some fragile startup. This was Lehman Brothers, a Wall Street institution that had survived the American Civil War, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the crash of 1929. 158 years old. So ask yourself the only question that matters. What actually stops a heart that strong? Not the weather outside. It was a lie. A lie this bank told, out loud on the official record, 4 times every single year. This is Flatline. Gloves on. Today's patient is 158 years old, and died of something the obituary got completely wrong. Tonight we open up Lehman Brothers. And I promise you the killer is not the one the headlines named. First, understand how mighty this thing was, because casualty of the crisis makes it sound like a bystander. It wasn't. Lehman started in 1850 as a humble cotton trading shop in Alabama, and clawed its way up over a century and a half to become one of the 4 great pillars of Wall Street, a global investment bank with around $639 billion in assets and 25,000 employees. Its people called themselves masters of the universe, and they meant it. And at the very top sat one man, Richard Fuld, nicknamed the Gorilla, the longest-serving chief executive on Wall Street, a famously ferocious competitor who had run Lehman for 14 years and believed in it like a religion. In early 2007, the stock touched $86 a share, and the firm looked untouchable. It had survived everything history could throw at it. It was about to be killed by its own accountant. So how does a 158-year-old fortress fall? Ask most people and you'll get one answer, delivered with total confidence: the financial crisis. Subprime mortgages, the housing crash, the whole system went down and Lehman went down with it. And look, the crisis was absolutely real and Lehman was absolutely gorged on toxic real estate. But here is the problem with blaming the weather. The storm hit every bank on the street. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, they were all standing in the same rain, holding the same poison. So why did this one bank collapse into the largest bankruptcy in human history, while the one standing right next to it walked away? The weather doesn't explain that. To explain that, you have to look at 2 things Lehman was doing that were entirely its own: how much it had borrowed, and how hard it worked to hide it. Let's start with the borrowing, because the number is genuinely insane. Lehman was leveraged at roughly 31 to 1. That means for every single dollar of its own money, the firm had borrowed and bet more than $30, the vast majority of it riding on real estate. Now do the simple, terrifying math. If you are leveraged 31 to 1, then your assets only have to fall by about 3% to 3%, and your entire cushion of real money is wiped out completely. You're insolvent. Bankrupt. And in 2008, real estate did not fall 3%. It fell off a cliff. Which means that, in reality, Lehman was already dead. The equity was gone. But a bank cannot simply announce that it's a corpse, because the instant the world believes you have no money, everyone demands their money back at once, and you're finished. So Lehman had a choice: confess or hide. It chose to hide. And the way it hid is the black beating heart of this entire autopsy. It was called Repo 105. Now, a repo is an ordinary boring tool, a short-term loan where a bank hands over some assets as collateral, gets cash, and buys the assets back a few days later. Everyone uses them. But Lehman's lawyers found a loophole. By over-collateralizing the deal, pledging $105 of assets for every 100 in cash, and leaning on a legal opinion out of London, Lehman could class these repos not as loans, but as true sales. And that one word changes everything. Because a loan stays on your balance sheet as debt. But a sale makes the assets vanish. So here is what Lehman actually did. In the last few days before the end of every quarter, right before it had to show its books to investors and regulators, right before the physical, it would sell around $50 billion of assets and debt straight off its balance sheet. Poof. Gone. Its leverage would suddenly look calm and healthy and responsible. And then, a few days after the quarter closed and everyone had looked away, it would buy the whole $50 billion right back and pile it on again. Think about what that actually is. Repo 105 was flushing your own arteries clean the morning of every checkup, passing the exam, and then re-clogging them the moment the doctor left the room. Lehman did this quarter after quarter after quarter. And its auditor, Ernst Young, one of the biggest accounting firms on earth, the very people paid to catch exactly this, looked at it and signed off. Lehman didn't have a heart attack in September of 2008. It had been faking its own blood work for years, and the gorilla would not let go. As the walls closed in through 2008, buyer after buyer came to the table. Warren Buffett, a Korean bank, Bank of America, Barclays, and Richard Fuld, still valuing his firm at the fantasy price printed on those doctored books, kept saying no. He was convinced, right up to the end, that Lehman was too big to fail, that Washington would ride in and rescue it, the way it had just rescued Bear Stearns. So let's call the time of death. In September 2008, the market finally stopped believing the numbers. The stock that had been $86 collapsed towards $7. Barclays walked. Bank of America walked and bought Merrill Lynch instead. And this time the government drew a line in the sand and said, no bailout. On the 15th of September, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, $639 billion in assets, the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the world. And its collapse detonated the global financial crisis, the very crisis that everyone would then turn around and blame for its death. The corpse had caused the storm. 2 years later, a court-appointed examiner published a 2,000-page report that dragged Repo 105 into the daylight for the entire world to see. And the people it had lied to spent the next 14 years picking through the wreckage, eventually recovering about 41 cents on the dollar. Now for the finding. The line I'd actually write on the certificate. It does not say the financial crisis. Cross that out. What killed Lehman Brothers was not the market. It was the cover-up. Lehman built its entire existence on 31-to-1 leverage, a machine that only survives as long as asset prices never, ever fall. And when they inevitably fell, instead of confessing, it chose to fake its own blood work, quarter after quarter, until the one day the market demanded a real test, and found nothing inside. The crisis wasn't the disease. The crisis was the margin call that finally came due on a bank that had been lying about its own pulse for years. It confused looking healthy with being healthy. So here's the scar to keep. Be terrified of any institution that is frightened of its own numbers. Leverage is not strength. Leverage is a promise that nothing bad will ever happen, and something bad always, eventually, happens. And when a company learns to gain the exact moment it gets measured, to look perfect on the day of the test, and rot every other day, then the test is the only thing keeping it alive, and the truth is just waiting for its turn. We've got a whole ward of them now. Kodak clutched its film. Nokia married its keyboard. MySpace rented out its own crowd. Sears got handed to a mad scientist. WeWork was a landlord in a prophet's clothing. Vine got left to die by the company that owned it. AOL Time Warner married at the top and buried each other. And Lehman Brothers, Lehman cooked its own blood test, 4 times a year, for years. Right up until the morning, its heart simply stopped, and no amount of clever paperwork could start it again. See you in the next autopsy.